Americans didn't want, and by golly, they got it through. They rammed it through. They used carrots. They dangled benefits. They added all kinds of pork to bills. They threw in something for the big pharmaceuticals. They threw something for the trial lawyers. They threw something in for the AMA. They certainly threw a big juicy bone in for AARP. Well, a bunch of juicy bones, actually. They threw all these things in for all these interest groups, except for the one who poll after poll, certainly not that a majority of Americans didn't want, and by golly, they got it through. They rammed it through. They used carrots. They dangled benefits. They added all kinds of pork to bills. They threw in something for the big pharmaceuticals. They threw something for the trial lawyers. They threw something in for the AMA. They certainly threw a big juicy bone in for AARP. Well, a bunch of juicy bones, actually. They threw all these things in for all these interest groups, except for the one who poll after poll said, we don't want it. Don't do this. You promised us you would negotiate a health care bill on C-SPAN, and we would be able to see who was out for the people. So all the people could assume was that because none of that was done on C-SPAN, other than a dog and pony show after it was basically done and about to be crammed down Republicans' throats anyway, we had a little summit. And it got crammed down our throats anyway, and Americans didn't want it. Well, I did go through the original 1,000-page bill. I went through the 2,000-page bill. I put off going through the 2,900-page bill because who knew if there would be a third or fourth, a fourth or fifth on top of that. I didn't want to end up going through yet another bill that wasn't going to be the one that really was the one that was seriously going to be made law. So I put it off. And when I got around to going through and reading the 2,900-page bill, you know, I'll admit I was wanting to look at what the sections did, their effect. And so I was struck by finding really ingenious or insidious language and drafting provisions, depending on your viewpoint. For example, with abortion, there was a section there saying, you know, you couldn't have federal funds for abortion, but over in the section that was going to allow it, instead of mentioning the word abortion, it just referred to the section. So if you went online and did a word search for the word abortion, you wouldn't see all of the provisions that allowed for abortion and federal funding. You would only find a restricted group. That kind of really clever hiding of what was going on. I passed over a lot of the numbers that were utilized, and so it was a bit surprising to find out here recently, and going back through, and Ernie Istook, former member here that I served with, now with the Heritage Foundation, yesterday provided me with copies of specific pages of the bill. And again, this is Public Law 111-148 and 111-152. But if you looked at let's see, consolidated print -26. Here it says down here, there is hereby appropriated to the Secretary out of any funds in the Treasury not otherwise appropriated, $30 million for the first fiscal year. And it goes on, and another page says, there are hereby appropriated to the trust fund the following, and it appropriated $10 million for this, $50 million for that, $150 million for that. Another $150 million, another $150 million. And you go through these, and it's staggering how much money was actually not authorized, but they used appropriating language. Because as many people know, and I'm finding more and more that are watching C-SPAN, but they know, gee, normally you have a budget. Well, there was no budget last year. The majority didn't want people to see exactly how the money would be budgeted, so they didn't bother with one in election year. First time in decades, as I understand it. But we didn't have a budget, and then we had this beginning of this continuing resolution stuff. But normally, you'll have a budget, you'll have an authorization for expenditure, but then it had to be followed up with an appropriation. Well, Obamacare went straight to it and appropriated vast amounts of money. And in fact, in this first year of 2011, fiscal year 2011, there's $4,951,000,000 appropriated in the bill. They apparently not only overran all the obstacles and hurdles that the founders put in our way to come up so that we would not come up with legislation that Americans did not want. They overcame that, and then just to make sure that it would be difficult to ever stop this by unfunding it, they actually didn't just authorize, they appropriated $105,464,000,000 in this Obamacare bill. Over $105 billion from 2011 through 2019. $105 billion. Now, the rules get a little complicated around here, and any amendment that seeks to rescind a prior appropriation is going to be subject to a point of order objection and not be allowed because it legislates in an appropriating bill, and under our rules you can't legislate an appropriating bill. So the only way, and these people that put this language in here, they knew it. When they were telling America, we know we're broke, we've got to rein in spending, all the while they were sticking in $105 billion of spending in one bill. Not authorizing, not saying, gee, you may not be able to afford this 5 or 6, 7 years from now. So instead, they just said, we're appropriating it, and you can't do anything about it because under the House rules, you try to bring up an amendment to rescind that, it's subject to a point of order objection, and we can keep it from coming out. The only way that I understand that this $105 billion that's now been appropriated by the last Congress, the only way that can be taken out is to have a provision in the original bill from the appropriators, not an amendment, a provision that rescinds this $105 billion of appropriations in this prior law from last year, and it's in the original bill, and then the Rules Committee waives any point of order objections to that rescission being in the appropriating bill. My understanding is that's the only way we can get it done. The amendments we were trying to do and that we got done apparently are not going to accomplish that. We're going to have it in an original committee bill rescinding all of this massive amount of money. And right now we'll be borrowing 42 cents of every dollar of that $105 billion. It's irresponsible. It's almost inconceivable, except here it is in black and white in front of us. America deserves better than this. You know, I told some folks back home, I've mentioned before, it strikes me that this government in the last, not just 4 years, but even going back into the last few years, and especially the TARP bailout that was such a disaster and should never have been passed, that this government, it became like a parent who had an overwhelming desire to spend and could not control their own spending. So the parent goes to the bank and says, you've got to loan me massive amounts of money. And the bank says, how are you going to pay it back? You're not going to live long enough to ever pay this back. And the parent says, no, but I've got my children here, and they're going to have children, and those children will have children. So my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, I'm pledging they're going to pay back all of this self-centered, massive amounts of money I'm throwing upon me and my friends, and I'm pledging and promising my children will be indentured servants for the rest of their lives because I can't stop spending.